The People Not Titles podcast is brought to you by Land Trust Title Services, your partners for results.
Thank you, Lukas, for taking time out.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Steve. So getting into this, we could go to the next slide, Ian, if you're in control of that. But I also want to know how many of you, and I know I can't see everyone on the screen, but how many of you are commercial real estate brokers or consider yourselves commercial real estate? Okay, some hands. I know some of you are off camera, but usually when I teach a class about commercial, I guess it did surprise me only the first time that I get a lot of residential brokers who want to learn more about commercial transactions. So, and that's completely fine. And so, I think the topics that we kind of go through and what we'll go through today, which is primarily environmental issues in a commercial transaction, due diligence, which is also really a part of environmental, is part of due diligence, and then LOIs, letters of intent. We're going to go through that. I know we're limited on time, so I'll talk fast, but stop me at any point. I'm not, typically when I teach a class, we hand out like a case study, and I'll kind of make some reference to that case study here because I feel like it's always more helpful to have like a real life situation and learn from that as opposed to just looking at slides. So this case study that I provide here, imagine like it's a real transaction that I did in Wicker Park. It's been a long time now, I think over 10 years, but it essentially had about 6 retail spaces on the street level and about 18 residential apartments above. So, there's some references to that in these slides, which you don't need to necessarily pay attention to, but when necessary, I'll let you know why there are these references, because if you don't have the materials, the case study itself, it may not make much sense. In any event, so having that in mind, if you could picture that type of building, mixed use, right? That's what we call it, because part of it is for commercial use and part of it is for residential use. So keep that in mind as we kind of go through this. So environmental concerns, obviously, if you're representing a commercial client in purchasing a property, the environmental concerns almost always come up. So here, when is it necessary? Whether you're buying vacant land, older commercial or industrial land, and bank required. So bank required is anytime you're getting a loan on a commercial property, and not buying it all for cash, I could almost guarantee you a phase 1 environmental report is going to be required. And so here in our kind of case study, one of the retail spaces that's on the first floor is a dry cleaning facility. So keep that in mind as we kind of go through this. So a phase 1 environmental, what is it? Here quoted from CERCLA, the purpose of the phase 1 assessment is to identify really sources of environmental contaminants. Okay, those are things that are here: asbestos containing material, biological hazards, lead-based substances, etc. Those are also known in the industry. I got to get the word exactly correct, because sometimes there's two things. There's volatile organic compounds, but in general, these are recognized environmental conditions. Okay, RECs. So recognized environmental conditions are essentially what you're trying to identify through a phase 1. That's generally the way, the easiest way to discuss this. And recognized environmental conditions are things such as asbestos, any type of hazardous material, radon gas levels, et cetera, et cetera. So phase 1, and we'll go into the next slide too, but phase 1 is very limited by really the environmental company that performs it only kind of does like a investigation into and research into like historical data, right? So they'll look at any type of permits, like what it was used for in the past, whether there's any history of like underground tanks, any history of way back when it could have been used, as maybe even things that are common, like a dry cleaner, an auto body shop, a gas station. Those things are all like red flags. So a phase one is going to look into that and first determine whether there's any concern at all through like historical data and research. Because if you don't have that, then you don't really need to go to the next step, which would be a phase two. How much does it cost? Ooh, that's probably an old number there, 1,500 plus. I think that's still possible, but just for inflation, we'll make it 2,000 plus. So that's something that's typically something that a bank is always going to require. Now, sometimes clients will ask me, well, the seller, has a phase one that they used when they were buying the property, and maybe they're, selling it and in a pretty quick amount of time. So the phase one is fairly new. I haven't seen many times where a bank isn't going to want its own new phase one. So unlike, sometimes it's similar to like a survey, right, where you need a newer one, but sometimes you could get away with an older one. Here, you typically will need a phase one, regardless of whether there is an older one that the seller may have. So let's flip to the next slide. Before I go into the additional due diligence part, I wanted to talk about something that isn't on here, which is phase two. If your phase one determines that there's potential for contaminants, then potential for recognized environmental conditions, then likely the bank is going to require you to do a phase two. So in this case study that we had, there sure enough was a dry cleaning facility. Now, the thing is, with these days, what's different than back in the day is that these days, if you have a dry cleaning facility, it may not be the worst thing in the world, because most of these dry cleaning facilities do the cleaning offsite. So you see the dry cleaning trucks, they take the clothes offsite to a different facility that's not part of the retail space. And really the retail space is just used for collecting and then returning the clothes. In our case, the dry cleaning facility actually cleaned the clothes on site. So what was required was a phase two. Phase two is the actual physical examination of the site. So depending on what it is, if you have concerns, environmental concerns, typically what would be done is borings. Borings into the ground, into the soil. Even if you have a dry cleaner, they may do a boring right through the middle of the floor of the store in order to do a proper examination of, in a phase two of the soil. The soil then will, by looking at that, doing that boring, and borings sometimes are even done in multiple places, we'll see what contaminants are potentially in the soil. If there are, the phase two continues with the remediation scope of it. So how do we get the contaminants out of the soil? How do we make this a property that does not need to be, that is safe to sell, and that a bank loaning money on the sale will be okay with, so that there's not any future concerns, any future risks that the bank would undertake, and in that case, the buyer undertakes. So with a phase two, the costs can be very significant. Okay, so if we have $1,500, $2,000 for a phase one, the phase two depends on, the scope of what needs to be done and if there's remedial work. In our case here, I think what ended up happening is that it costs about $50,000. Now, the sale, if I remember correctly, was about, gosh, I want to say it, close to like 10 million-ish, 11, if I remember correctly. So that's, comparatively, it's not a huge number, but it's significant enough. I mean, no one's going to want to pay that. The question I always get is, who pays for that, right? It's the buyer's bank that requires the phase one. It's the buyer really that is asking for it and needs it in order to close. So shouldn't the buyer pay for these costs? Certainly the phase one, the buyer should pay for it, but on the phase two, the seller now knows that the seller has a problem. So if this deal doesn't go through, it's similar to like if you had, a residential deal that has found mold. Now the seller knows. Now the seller and you as the agent have to inform them that they have to disclose the knowledge of mold, and well, we might as well just get it remediated. So typically there's going to be some negotiation on who needs to do this. I think in this case, honestly, there was a split like down the middle where both sides chipped in for the cost of the remediation. So, other than that, with environmental concerns, we talked about the phase one and phase two, which is typically what comes up in these sales and how to get by the environmental concerns. But you could have other things. There's USTs, underground storage tanks that were often used sometimes to heat facilities in the past, or especially in the case of a property that was a gas station that had underground storage tanks. Why are those a concern? Because over time, those will typically start to leak. And then hazardous material gets in the soil, and that becomes quite a problem. So, they're especially a concern if you want to redevelop land, tear something down that's been there for a while and redevelop it. Usually if you have vacant land that's been vacant for a long time, while you'll need a phase one, you're probably more in the clear, depending on how long it's been actually vacant. So those are environmental concerns that often come up. Are there any questions on that topic? If anyone wants to jump in and ask a question before we get into the more other aspect of due diligence, please do. No? Okay. So other aspects of due diligence, that's the other topic, although, the environmental is certainly part of your due diligence. Zoning in commercial, right? Zoning, and what I mean by that is not only determining the zoning, but also potentially changing the zoning if you need to, or determining whether you will have to change the zoning. So when is it necessary? Here's the made-up address that we used, 1200 Agent Avenue. In the case of our case study, it wouldn't be necessary. Why? Well, if you had all the information is that the buyer is buying this, investment, this as an investment property that's already existing, has been existing for years, and it doesn't really need zoning because we would have to, at least have to determine whether the zoning is appropriate, but chances are that if the property exists as it does and has been for a while, then it complies with the zoning requirements for the area. However, when is it more necessary? In the situation of vacant land, if you're buying vacant land for development, or it may not be vacant, but it's going to be a tear down that you want to redevelop. And so what do we do as a preliminary search for that? You guys could do it as agents. It doesn't take, a zoning guru attorney or anyone else that's really super knowledgeable of it. Simply, if you go to City of Chicago and you can just Google this City of Chicago zoning maps, they have a nice kind of portal with access to zoning maps where you just pretty much I think you could even mark the space, the area where you want to look at, or type in the address. It takes you to that place, and then it'll have a boundary and a color code for what zoning it's in. So imagine like if it's shaded, yellow, it's RS1. If it's shaded orange, it could be RS2, RS3, et cetera, and then commercial categories of zoning as well. So that's kind of the way you determine zoning. People are kind of always mystified by, like, isn't there some type of like certificate I get that says what zoning it's in, and what classification, what category it's in? Well, you really don't, unless we talk about the certificate of zoning compliance, which that is only for residential property containing 5 or few dwelling units. The purpose of the certificates of zoning, you may have that in even like your residential transactions. Let's say you're selling like a 3 flat, right? That's when you're going to get a certificate of zoning. But that doesn't have so much to do with actual zoning. Well, it does in a sense, but it's not like the purpose of it is to show you the category or classification of zoning. The purpose of more of it is is how many units are identified in that residential property. So if you have a 3 flat, and this happens in Chicago all the time, where something is being sold as a 3 flat. But
hey, thanks for listening to the People Not Titles podcast. We are brought to you by our great sponsors, Land Trust Title Services, your partners for results.
But then it turns out on the certificate of zoning, when you get that at closing, it shows 2 residential dwelling units. And that's what it'll be marked at. It'll literally say, 2 residential dwelling units. Now you have a big problem. And that's something that you as agents, may want to get to if there's any doubt at the beginning of the deal, because the worst is to find that out at the end of the deal. That, wait, this was represented, and sometimes not to fool anyone and not with any ill intent, but this was represented as a transaction that contained 3 residential dwelling units, but it turns out it's really only certified for 2. That often happens because basements get turned into dwelling units without the city knowing. So you have, those garden apartments, right, that we call them, instead of basement units. So that's I want you to understand the distinction. Finding out the zoning through the Chicago zoning maps is one thing. You could do that for residential, for commercial, and then it'll, based on that classification, it'll tell you what you're able to build, right? If you have a commercial classification or a mixed use that
just
allows,
got a text from the agent for Maggie, period.
Well, Kimberly, we could all hear you. Thank you for that information.
Sorry.
Anyway, moving on. So if you have a classification of whether it be residential or commercial, then you need to look into what does that allow. Okay, RS1, RS2, RS3, and then your commercial classifications will all tell you the density and the height restrictions, the FAR restrictions, which is how much square footage you could have. But that is, for a much for another day to get into that topic. So that versus the certificate of zoning compliance, which applies only to residential properties containing 5 or fewer dwelling units. And with that, there's zoning violations, right? You want to make sure none exist. And when you build, you will have no zoning violations. And if the property that you intended to build on the site does not fit the zoning, one of 2 options: you change what you're going to build, or you go into you go in for a zoning change with the city. Another aspect of due diligence, real quick. I know we already kind of got into this.
Lucas, I got a question. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, might be silly, but new here. the zoning violation, is it traditionally an attorney's job to kind of look into that? And more specifically, the zoning? I mean, obviously, I as the agent can say, hey, it's a C2, but do you go in there like in residential and look thoroughly if there's any verbiage of it going to be changing in the next year, or if there's any zoning violations, or
Yeah.
is that traditionally the broker's job?
No, I mean, whatever you could do, honestly, I always tell agents just makes you that much better of an agent, right? Like if you do that. When I have things that like an agent brings to my attention, that typically they don't, I always feel like, wow, all right, this agent is on top of things. Like this is someone I want to represent, my potential clients in the future. So while it is more of an attorney's job to find that out, on the same angle, if you're representing a seller and you're a listing agent and you know about it, you definitely would, or your client knows about it, you definitely have to disclose it, right? So that would be more in line with the scope of your requirements as an agent. Certainly, if you could find something out, you have to disclose it. The worst thing is to wait for it, wait till the end and then have it be a big problem and it blows up in your face. All right. So again, with soil tests.
Hey, Lucas,
Yes.
we have a question in the chat that I just noticed.
Yeah.
Are we required to obtain certificate of zoning compliance for residential properties?
Containing 5 or fewer dwelling units. Yes. Yes, absolutely. You won't close without it. It'll be an exception on title. So not you as the agent. That's typically, so I don't know if that's specific to you as the agent or us as the attorneys or the seller itself. But you will not close in the city of Chicago without having that certificate of zoning compliance. It's a exception to title. So that's the way it works, right? The title company makes exceptions to title. One of those will be the requirement to obtain a zoning cert, and they won't issue title without waiving that exception. So, can you potentially close and not have that exception waived on title? Yes, but it would be very risky. I would never suggest to do that. I mean, it doesn't take that long, so I would just put a pause on the closing and get it. It's happened where the attorneys have forgotten to obtain that. I would not close without it, just because I've had so many situations where unfortunately, you think it's a 3 flat. It turns out only a two dwelling units are certified as being legal. Okay. Unless there's anything else, I'll move on. The new soil tests. Again, we talked about soil tests within the scope of like a phase 2, but there's also soil tests for suitability of soil for building. So if you have vacant land, absolutely, I would spend the money on doing that. If you have land where you already have a structure, chances are it's suitable for development, unless it's a completely different type of development, higher in density, bigger, more square footage, etc. But the soil test determines what type of soil. If it's too clay, like there's too much clay, and we'll require for the foundations to be deeper. Deeper foundations mean more money. Those are all things that you need to know. And are at least good to, as agents, for you to advise your client to do. All right, next slide. Due diligence. Okay, continued. So the other thing is too, on like this case study that we have here, we have leased property, right? I told you at the beginning we had 18 residential leases and 8 retail commercial leases. So that is going to be something that's so much different than doing residential, is really getting into like the financial aspect of this deal. Because typically when you have a buyer, all commercial property really is, unless it's for their intended use. If it's an investment property, it's a big math problem. That's all it is. Most of these buyers don't really care how, sexy the property is, how new fixtures are and the bathrooms are. I mean, in the end, you could have a brand new property that just isn't doing as well as an old property that's getting, better rent, has less expenses, has less of a tax liability, et cetera, et cetera. So what I mean by that, those are cap rates, right? You look at what income is being generated and you look at what the expenses are. And that is going to be key. So you want to look at these things, rent rolls. You typically, what I'd ask for is P&Ls, there's a profit and loss statements or income statements, and really get into the nitty gritty of, through the rent rolls, your income. So that's pretty easy, but you don't have a good grasp on expenses, right? So you want to really determine what all the expenses are. The bigger ones are property taxes, right? And I don't even mean to say like your mortgage, because your mortgage is going to be particular to your buyer, or your monthly mortgage payment. So what I mean is things outside of that could be utilities, right? Electrical, gas. It could be things that require snow removal, landscaping. Those are kind of like the ongoing, trash removal. And then your capital expenditures, which are bigger ones, like replacement of a roof, replacement of a parking lot. See if that was done. And then moving along, because I know I'm dragging on here, feasibility. Part of your due diligence is going to be a feasibility. Sometimes the buyer, if it's a really sophisticated transaction, will do a feasibility study, which lets them know based on zoning, based on the site, site conditions, what can the buyer build to get the most bang for its buck. Do you want commercial space, even if you could have it, or is residential going to get you more money? How are the taxes, property taxes, going to work if you have only residential versus residential and commercial? On a new development too, like, do you really, is it worth building 20 units just because you can? Or are we not taking into consideration the construction cost of that? And maybe we'd be better off with doing a smaller project. It's particular to the buyer, and that's what a feasibility study. And those are, typically we wouldn't do that as an attorney. We could help with like some consulting on it, but there are particular consultants that will do that. And those probably run, not cheap. Let's put it that way. All right, moving on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to talk about real briefly as the last topic, LOIs. Isn't too complicated of a topic, but I actually just had someone that I talked to this week, and this question got brought up. They were seeking the client. The agent called me. Their client was seeking to purchase some vacant land, and the question was whether we should present a letter of intent or just present a contract in and of itself. I'll get into that. Well, I could probably actually just answer that question before we get into the aspects of it. Typically, a letter of intent is used when the deal is more expensive, requires more due diligence, is more sophisticated or complicated. Meaning, like here with the case study, we have 18 apartment units, 8 retail commercial units. You have a parking lot, you have a bunch of expenses, and it's for millions and millions of dollars, in excess of 10, let's call it. Yeah, I would start out with an LOI. Okay, we're not gonna, as an agent, you don't want to get the attorney involved. First of all, you don't want to use a boilerplate contract, right? That would be foolish in this case. It's just too sophisticated, too complicated to just use a boilerplate. There are some good ones. I'm not going to lie. That either Main Street or Carr provides, but the more, let's just say, the more expensive it is in general, the less likely you're going to want to use a boilerplate contract. So that goes into your consideration. So in this case, the case of our case study with the 18 apartments, 8 retail, we're going to want an LOI. And the other part of the reason why I want you to use an LOI in this case, it's because it's quicker, right? And you could do it, actually. You know, I have oftentimes brokers that will give me an LOI that they already presented that's in the works, and they say, okay, we need a definitive contract based on this. Other times, a broker will give me the LOI to review before it's submitted, to be like, hey, are we missing anything? So what do you need to not be missing? Number one, the parties, right? Who will be a party to the agreement? Pretty simple. There's got to be language in it that it's non-binding. So that's important, because honestly, if both parties sign off on it and it doesn't say that, that could be taken as a sufficient contract. There are no requirements really in the law of what you need in a real estate contract as opposed to any other contract. So if you have the parties, consideration, meaning identifying the money, identifying what's going to be purchased, and mutual assent to those terms, that is all you really need. And an LOI is sufficient, is definitely sufficient to be a binding contract if it doesn't say that it's non-binding. So that's huge. Never do an LOI without that language. What's the purpose of it? You want to flesh out the major deal terms, right? So instead of going through this definitive purchase agreement where you have an attorney draft a 20-page agreement or so just to have it never be signed because it's going to fall apart, you want to make sure the major deal terms are in there. I don't know if, Ian, can you really quickly go to the next slide and see if, and maybe I'll have you go back. Yeah, okay, so go back to that. I know, go back to the other one before there, please. Just want to finish this off. You know, purpose, and it also psychologically commits the parties to enter into a definitive agreement. So once you have that, it's so much better than just talking and being like, hey, you know, we're going to write an offer, we're going to get you something. This is like a pretty solid committed step. And then you negotiate the business terms, right? So this is, like it says, your time to shine. What's on the LOI, like the main components of it, which Ian, you could get to the next slide, really are going to be what's on the definitive purchase and sale agreement. So this is not a time to put in a purchase price that is going to be, if you're representing a buyer, you know, much less on the actual final purchase and sale agreement. That is only going to piss off the seller. And so you cannot change those terms significantly. What we do with the final purchase agreement is we add terms, we make it, you know, we for example get into the due diligence aspect a lot more, you know, conditions of closing, et cetera, but these key things that need to be in an LOI are going to be also in the purchase and sale agreement. So key dates, the date for the purchase and sale agreement. So what I mean by that is we may need to enter into a purchase and sale agreement by this time. That kind of keeps the parties' feet to the fire. You don't have to have that, but it's always good to do. Earnest money, how much earnest money, due diligence, how much time is needed for due diligence, how much time is needed for closing. You're going to have obviously the purchase price, financing, whether you're going to have financing and potentially how much of it is going to be financed. Obviously, the less that's going to be financed, the more attractive to the seller. And again, the scope of your due diligence inspection, is it going to be 15 days? Is it going to be 30 days? Is it going to be 60 days? What are you going to want to see? Here we get a little repetitive. I told you that it's non-binding. The last two items are also very important that are often missed. Exclusivity during the LOI term. So if you have that date by which, you know, we have to either enter into a final agreement or we don't, during that date, you don't want this property to be shopped around, right? If you're representing the buyer, you don't want the seller to keep shopping this around and then be like, hey, we're out because we got a better price. That is not fair to the buyer at this point. although it could happen. It could happen, right? And then finally, broker's compensation. You want to put that in there, okay? Let's make sure we know we've identified who the brokering parties are, so that there's no surprises and that we don't go through, this purchase and sale agreements. Sometimes could take a week, 2 weeks, depending on how lazy or busy the attorneys are, just to then find out that, like, oh wait, we weren't responsible for that agent, because commercial real estate is a much more different than in that regard than residential. Residential, although, I say that when things just recently changed very significantly on the residential, but let's not, let's talk prior to November 1st. People were pretty aware on the residential side what they're going to get paid. On commercial, it could be a whole host of things. So you want to make sure that information's in there. All right. And then the last slide, I think, is it. Just information for me. I know I went over. I knew I was going to go over my allotted time. I apologize, Ian. But I hope it was somewhat useful.
Hey, thanks for listening to the People Not Titles podcast. We are proudly sponsored by Land Trust Title Services. If you enjoyed the podcast, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. And we'd love it if you'd share our podcast with your friends. Thanks a lot.